You come expecting wide-open skies, the clean, hard light that flattens distance into highways and cattle fences, the kind of place where every horizon seems to answer to a practical purpose. Grazing, mining, roads, the slow logic of settlers' plots. But step off the interstate, walk uphill where the wind climbs like a living thing, and you find that expectation splinters. Here, where sagebrush catches fog and the mountains bruise the skyline, there are places that refuse to be explained away by maps or by the tidy chapters of recorded history. They keep their questions like a physical thing, stacked stones that insist on a ceremony long forgotten, petroglyphs that catch the sun just so and whisper of peoples who track the stars in ways that don't fit our neat calendars, buried hearths that predate the earliest settlers by thousands of years. If you listen as you walk, the land will pry open a subtle, stubborn voice. We were here before your names, before your rulers, before your timekeeping. The promise of this script is not to solve every riddle for you, but to hold those riddles up to the light and let their edges show. I want to take you, carefully, respectfully, into 6 or 7 of the most persistent, troubling, and beautiful mysteries of Wyoming. We will measure and narrate, but we will also imagine, because imagination is a tool in archaeology as much as the trowel is. It lets us move across evidence with curiosity rather than certainty. Along the way I will show you what has been found, the artifacts, the bones, the alignments, the competing scientific explanations, and the mythic stories that people have wrapped around these sites. I will ask you to picture yourself standing in the chill dawn or under a summer moon, because perspective matters. What looks like a circle from a plane looks like intention from the ground. This is a land where the past is layered like strata, where the human and the geological have been keeping time together for millennia, and where every new piece of data tends to generate more questions than it answers. I will be both your guide and your skeptic, firm in the facts we can establish, generous with the possibilities we cannot, and always insistent that the unknowns are not failures of science but invitations. There will be precise dates when they exist, cultures when they can be named, and distances and measurements when they matter. There will also be speculation, myth, and the kinds of local stories that do not fit on a laboratory sheet but are indispensable to understanding why people care. Above all, I want you to feel the scale, not only the thickness of sediment in a dig, or the measured diameter of a stone ring, but the human time that stretches behind each site. These are places where hunters paused, where astronomers may have stood, where children's laughter has long since dissolved into the wind, if laughter was ever recorded by the stones at all. I promise you revelations of detail, dates, cultures, material traces, and the deeper revelation that knowing more often grows the mystery. Keep your skepticism and your wonder close. We will leave the door open at the end. Some secrets still lie just beneath your feet, and that is the point. Picture a ring of stones high on a limestone ridge, sitting with an exposed view of valley and sky so wide it humbles any attempt at human scale. The stones form a carefully measured circle, an inner cairn, and a web of spokes that reach outward like ribs from a silent heart. It looks at once like a philosophy made visible and like a compass someone left for the future. This is the medicine wheel on Medicine Mountain, a roughly circular pattern of stones approximately 80 to 82 feet across, with a central cairn about 12 feet in diameter and 28 radial lines extending to a peripheral circle, set at an elevation near 9,640 feet, an architectural choice that seems to consider the sky as much as the land. For researchers and for the indigenous peoples who revere it, the medicine wheel is both a palpable construction and a spiritual loom where astronomical, social, and ceremonial threads have been woven for an unknown length of time. The scale alone tells a story. Moving and stacking that amount of rock at that altitude is not an accidental act. The stones do not belong to a single obvious cultural signature in the way pottery or projectile point typology might reveal. Instead, they announce human purpose through geometry, placement, and persistent presence. Scholars have documented the medicine wheel in detail, measuring its diameter, counting its spokes and cairns, and mapping the horizon lines it contacts on solstices and certain star risings, and yet the site resists singular explanation. Some early investigators proposed that it might be a ceremonial site tied to the seasonal cycles of local tribes, an idea that aligns with the general function of many stone circles around the world as markers of time or ritual. Others have argued for an astronomical observatory hypothesis, that specific spokes and cairns align with the rising points of the sun, moon, or particular bright stars on astronomically significant dates, perhaps aiding in calendrical reckoning for migratory herds or ritual cycles. The spokes, the central hollow cairn, and the peripheral cairns all point to a plan that reads like a manual for watching the sky, and yet the variety of alignments, some precise, some approximate, complicates the narrative for those who want only one answer. Now, let's be fair, archaeology has its limits, and stone alignments can be notoriously tricky to date and easy to overinterpret. Stones can be rearranged by weather, by later visitors, by grazing animals. Cairns can be built atop older structures, and the idea of a single purpose for any monument often collapses under the weight of its multiple uses across generations. Still, for all the caution, the medicine wheel sits atop a ridge that dominates its landscape and invites repeated human engagement. Indigenous oral histories, especially from Piegan Blackfeet and other plains cultures, describe the wheel as a sacred and cosmically significant place, even if we cannot map those myths directly onto the archaeological evidence without risking appropriation or error. The convergence of cultural memory and geometric complexity is suggestive of a place of lasting communal importance. But here's where it gets tricky. Early radiocarbon dates from materials in the vicinity suggest human activity in the Bighorn Range that spans centuries, possibly millennia. But precise dating of the wheel itself is problematic because stone does not radiocarbon date, and there is a scarcity of undisturbed organic layers directly associated with the construction. In consequence, some fringe theories have seized on the uncertainty to propose wildly anachronistic origins, ranging from transatlantic voyagers to lost advanced cultures or even extraterrestrial builders, claims that have no supporting evidence but feed well into the mythic appetite people have for the extraordinary. Now, let's be fair once more, extraordinary claims require extraordinary data, and there is none to support such spectacular ideas about the medicine wheel. Instead, the leading academic story remains cautious and plural. One credible line of interpretation situates the wheel squarely within the seasonal and ritual practices of indigenous peoples on the northern plains, reading the structure as a social and ceremonial locus that could also serve calendrical functions, an ancient community center where movement, memory, and the sky meet. Another scholarly strand emphasizes practical landscape reading. The wheel's placement allows watchers to track snow melt, bison movements, and weather patterns, practical knowledge of enormous import to people whose survival depended on tracking subtle ecological cycles. Both interpretations can be true at once. The wheel can be a site of ritual integration and of seasonal navigation, because human structures typically encode multiple registers of meaning. Still, for all the evidence of design and careful placement, we still don't know when the medicine wheel in its present form first took shape, who precisely made each stone placement, or whether the alignments we read today were intentional from the first stacking or accrued meaning over generations who renewed, refined, and reoriented the circle. Imagine yourself walking that exposed ridge at dawn, fog clinging low to the valley bones, a line of wind that seems to speak in a pitched, dry voice across the stones. The light at that altitude scours and clarifies. You can watch the horizon while feeling the weight of the cairn under your foot. There is a kind of human choreography written into the wheel, the endless turning of bodies, the marking of seasons, the quieting of people's breath when the sun slips into a particular notch and something that was routine becomes sanctified. And there is a reflective ache in that choreography, that ephemeral human breaths and long-lived stones negotiate meaning across the centuries. It ties us, the ones who come to measure and the descendants who come to honor, into a shared human wonder about how we mark time and place. Now, with the medicine wheel in mind, consider the curious cohabitation of precise measurement and poetic mystery that defines many Wyoming sites. The evidence is often meticulous, but the meaning is layered, local, and sometimes kept deliberately private by the stewards of the land. That tension between the empirical and the sacred is, in itself, part of the story, and perhaps the most important mystery of all. We still don't know the full human story that made these stone geometries possible. That lack is not a failure of investigation but a reminder that some histories are embedded in practices and words that do not fossilize easily. There is a monolith that rises from the prairie like a hymn gone solid, Devil's Tower, also called Bear Lodge or Matotipola, a towering column of hexagonal basalt ribs that climbs 867 feet from base to summit and lifts its crown to about 5,112 feet above sea level. And the question that clings to that place is simple and stubborn. How did a single, solitary rock become the center of so many stories, scientific, sacred, and strange? The tower's sheer vertical faces, the long, fluted columns that look like the frozen fingers of some giant hand, do not read as a casual geological accident. They announce themselves with the kind of deliberate geometry that draws human attention the way a lighthouse draws ships. Geologically speaking, the dominant explanation is also precise. Devil's Tower is an igneous intrusion, a mass of magma that cooled beneath the surface, contracting into polygonal columns as it solidified, columns that later stood revealed when the softer sedimentary rocks around them eroded away. In other words, the tower is not a volcanic plug in the strictest sense, nor is it an erected edifice. It is a story of fire and time, where the internal skin of the earth folded into a columnar skeleton and waited a very long time to be shown to the sky. Those measurements, the 867 feet from base to summit, the summit elevation, the regular, six-sided columns, are crucial because they ground us. This is a natural structure, measurable and describable, and yet the tower refuses to let the scientific reading be the whole story. Now, let's be fair. Devil's Tower is also a place where human meanings pile up like cairns at its base. Indigenous oral histories from the Lakota, Cheyenne, Crow, Arapaho, Kiowa, and other peoples speak of the tower as Matotipola, Bear Lodge, or the place where the Great Spirit put a rock to save standing children from a sky bear that clawed at the earth. In those versions, the vertical grooves come from the bear's claws as it tried to climb, and the children were lifted to the top as a rock that became their refuge. Such origin tales function differently than geological descriptions. They encode social memory, moral contours, and a relationship between people and place that is not reducible to chemistry. That tension, between the scientist's precision and the storyteller's sacred map, is a second kind of architecture around the tower. For many indigenous communities, the tower is not only a place with a past but a living place with protocols, prayer, offerings, and seasonal pilgrimages. Contemporary debates over the site's proper name, whether to officially restore indigenous names like Bear Lodge, are therefore not mere semantics. They are entangled with rights, recognition, and the way a nation remembers its own history. The National Park Service has long tried to mediate these layers, acknowledging indigenous affiliations while operating within federal naming procedures that are slow to change. But here's where it gets tricky. The tower's very appearance feeds a set of competing narratives that range from the reasonable to the sensational. Scientists who study columnar jointing, how cooling igneous bodies form regular, polygonal fracture patterns, point out that similar hexagonal columns form in other parts of the world where volcanic or intrusive rocks cool slowly, Staffa in Scotland, the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, and parts of the Columbia River basalt in the American West. In that view, Devil's Tower is an accessible and dramatic lesson in geology, a visible cross-section of the planet's inner heat. Still, for all the explanatory power of this model, people have always been drawn to more extraordinary possibilities. Early visitors and some popular writers in the 20th century flirted with the tower as evidence of some lost advanced people, or as a signpost of transoceanic contact, or, more fantastically, as an alien landing place. Those ideas have no supporting data but persist because the tower's singularity invites mythic thinking. How else do you explain a perfect column rising from flat grassland? The real mystery here is human. Why do measured facts so often leave room for fantastical stories? And how do we honor both the facts and the human hunger for the marvelous? There is also an archaeological and historical layer that complicates the picture. Euro-American explorers and appropriators recorded the tower's presence in the late 19th century, and its designation as a national monument in 1906 was part of a broader national project to conserve and control spectacular landscapes. That conservation, though, has often been selective. The same federal apparatus that preserved the tower for climbers and tourists also regulated, sometimes clumsily, Indigenous access and practice. Importantly, the tower's climbing routes, some of them created in the early 20th century by an era of daredevils and enthusiasts, overlaid the place with another human story, that of recreation, risk, and the way modern people lay new rituals on old places. In recent decades, issues such as seasonal voluntary climbing closures and respect of indigenous ceremonial times have illustrated that even democratically open landscapes can host contested ethics. The tower is therefore not merely a monument of stone, it is an ongoing negotiation about who has the right to make meaning there, and how those meanings should be performed and protected. Now, let's be fair, policymakers, scientists, and tribal leaders have different tools and vocabularies. When they intersect at places like Devil's Tower, tension is inevitable. Imagine, for a moment, standing beneath the tower at twilight. The columns recline into shadow like the pleats of an enormous garment, and your voice ricochets with small echoes that feel both ancient and absurdly fresh. Picture yourself brushing the granite at the base, where lichen coats the stone like age, and looking up to see ravens hopping on ledges 1,000 feet above. In that silence you can almost hear the accretion of stories, the bear's claws, the cooling magma, the early climber's rope, the petition for a name. There is a human magnetism to that combination, physical drama married to narrative depth. It is in such a place that myth and method converse, where the geologist measures column widths and counts jointing patterns, while the storyteller maps the moral geography of a people's origin. Both perspectives are partial, and both are necessary. Still, for all the data and the eloquent native stories, and no matter how many tests we run or how many treaties we read, we still don't know the full human arc of the tower, that is, the complete timeline of how people have used and honored the place across millennia, how many sacred acts went unrecorded, and how the tower's meaning transformed as the steppe around it changed hands. We still don't know exactly which ancient gatherings stamped the earliest footprints into the soil there, nor the precise ways those gatherings were performed before colonial records rewrote the script. There is a mythic temptation that attaches to the tower, giants, sky people, or extraterrestrials who left behind perfect architecture. We must treat such temptations with both skepticism and empathy. Skepticism because no testable evidence supports a non-terrestrial origin. Empathy because myth answers questions science does not ask, questions about belonging, miracle, and human scale. When you stand at Devil's Tower, you are invited into a story that is geological, historical, spiritual, and emotional all at once. The deeper mystery is not whether the tower is volcanic, but why a single place can generate such a multiplicity of meanings, and why those meanings remain active today. It draws us because the tower does not simply stand, it speaks. We still don't know whether we can ever fully translate that speech into a single language, scientific, sacred, or popular, without losing something essential in the translation, and perhaps losing is part of what the tower guards. So we leave Devil's Tower with two things in our pockets: precise measurements that point to igneous intrusion, cooling columns, and erosion, and stories, oral histories that hold the site as holy, early climbing sagas that made the tower into a modern test of grit, and the increasingly urgent conversations about naming and access. Each of these facts opens a door to two more questions. When did the earliest ceremonies occur here? And how did the people who first told the bear story map their cosmology onto this rock? The tower's columns are physical grooves, but they are also grooves in human memory, slots where different cultures have hung their meanings. And that double groove is what makes this place both scientifically instructive and gloriously, stubbornly mysterious. We still don't know. Legend rock stares out of the sagebrush like a fossilized alphabet. Panels of shallow grooves and incised figures set across weathered sandstone slabs, a public archive that refuses to read itself easily. Here, in a scatter of outcrops north of the warm mineral springs that give Thermopolis its steam, hundreds of figures, humans, animals, abstract signs, ladder-like shapes, concentric circles, interrupt the rock face in a tableau that feels both intimate and intentionally monumental. The panels are not a casual scribble but a curated set of marks made over long time. A layered dialogue between artists who could be counted in dozens of generations. Archaeologists and tribal historians both treat legend rock as a palimpsest, pecked and repecked, touched and retouched across centuries. Many scholars place much of the rock art within the span of the Archaic through the late prehistoric periods, broadly from several thousand years ago into the last millennium, anchoring some motifs to plains or plateau traditions while accepting that stylistic overlaps and later reworkings cloud any tidy cultural assignment. If you measure the largest panels, they stretch across meters of exposed stone, with individual human-like figures sometimes standing a meter or more in height, suggesting that these were meant to be seen, not simply made for a private hand. The scale and density of the panels strongly suggest that this was a place of repeated, communal attention. People returned, added, corrected, and layered meaning across time until the rock held a kind of compressed memory that could survive weather and wandering. But here's where it gets tricky. Rock art resists tidy dating because the technique, pecking or incising, does not give up its age like charcoal in a hearth would. We rely on indirect clues such as patina formation, stylistic comparison, and the occasional associated datable deposit, and those methods give ranges more than exact years. Still, for all the technical frustration, the imagery itself offers clues. There are repeated motifs that seem to speak of hunting importance, bison and elk forms rendered in stylized outlines, alongside enigmatic anthropomorphic figures with exaggerated limbs or headdresses that some interpreters read as shamans, spirit beings, or initiates. Others see abstract signs, ladders, dots, rows of punctures, as maps of water, trails, or star charts. Now, let's be fair. When you propose that a ladder symbol encodes a watercourse or that concentric circles denote camps, you are making an inferential leap that must be tested and retested. Iconography is tempting to read as language, and yet we risk turning every mark into a sentence. Still, for all the caution, some possibilities command our imagination. One school of thought argues the panels function primarily as mnemonic devices for seasonal rounds, recording where to hunt, when to follow migrating herds, when certain plants ripened, essentially a non-literate repository of survival knowledge. Another credible theory emphasizes ritual and cosmology. The panels are not practical listings but ceremonial maps, places where the living negotiated with the unseen world, invoked ancestors, and staged rites of passage. A third, more speculative interpretation reads some of the spiral motifs and star-like punctures as astronomical markers, records of bright star risings, comet sightings, or ceremonial nights tied to cyclical celestial events. All of these interpretations can be true in part. Human places tend to do many jobs at once: practical work, mnemonic storage, social performance, and sacred belonging. Yet controversy and wonder cling to the rock like lichen. Local oral traditions sometimes insist on very specific narratives that are not easily reconciled with external archaeological taxonomies. Some local caretakers point to visions and rules of approach that outsiders ignore at their peril. There is even a persistent set of popular myths, giant beings traced in exaggerated figures, visitors from distant shores, or secret codes left by vanished cults, that have no empirical foundation but thrive because the panels so clearly network across time. Imagine walking the narrow path up to the panels at dusk, the sandstone warm from the day, the figures blurring as your eyes adjust and the first stars assert themselves. Picture a small circle of people cupping firelight and pointing to a spiral and telling a story whose words you do not yet know. In that moment the rock becomes a book you cannot quite read but from which you feel invited, not to own the text but to witness it. That is the core of the reflective insight here. The panels remind us that memory is often communal and performative. Rocks do not forget, and people, generations apart, keep returning to speak across a shared surface. Still, for all the interpretive finesse and the careful cataloging of motifs, we still don't know the full lexicon of legend rock, whose hands placed each mark, whether every motif had the same meaning to every generation, and which practices attached to which images have been lost entirely. We still don't know the exact time span of the panel's primary use, nor the precise recipes of meaning that stitched image to ceremony. The rock preserves questions more stubbornly than answers, and perhaps that persistence is its point. Shift inland a little and down across geological time to a different kind of archive, the Green River Formation, whose thinly layered limestones and shales record an Eocene world of fresh lakes, tropical brush, and a bewildering abundance of life preserved in exquisite detail. If Legend Rock is a human book, the green riverbeds are the planet's own illuminated manuscript. Fish with hoplites of fin rays, bats with wing membranes hinted in carbon shadows, plants that tell of humidity and warmth, and entire ecosystems paused in time as if for a careful portrait. The deposits in what we now call the fossil lake system, sprawling over areas of present-day Wyoming, Utah, and Colorado, formed in lakes between roughly 50 and 55 million years ago, during the Eocene epoch, an interval after the dinosaurs' extinction when mammals and modern plant families were diversifying into novel ecologies. The area that would become Fossil Butte National Monument preserves some of the most celebrated lagerstätten deposits in North America. The laminae of shale record seasonal die-offs and fine-grained settling that entombed whole fish with bones articulated and scales in place, a level of preservation that reveals both ordinary life and the occasional catastrophic die-off in startling clarity. Those measurements matter. In the green riverbeds, a single layer a few centimeters thick can contain dozens of specimens, each a microhistory of a lake's chemistry and a season's story. The data that has emerged from these rocks forced paleontologists to revise their understanding of Eocene climates, food webs, and even evolutionary timing. They showed warm inland lakes rich with fish and insects in a world far warmer than modern Wyoming, confirming that climates and ecosystems once looked very different on the same patch of ground. But here's where it gets tricky. Some of the fossil evidence from the Eocene evokes questions about migration and geography that still puzzle scientists. The presence of certain plant types and fish clades suggests dispersal routes and climate corridors that are not fully reconciled with paleogeographic reconstructions. Moreover, the fidelity of preservation, bones, stomach contents, sometimes even soft tissues or skin impressions, yields behaviors and diets we do not expect, and those behaviors force paleontologists to revisit their models of early mammalian and Piscean ecology. One set of theories emphasizes a stable, warm interior basin system that supported endemic species for long periods, while another model posits episodic connections with other basins and seas that allowed waves of faunal exchange. The tension between endemism and interchange is not merely technical, it informs how we think about extinction, adaptation, and the geographic roots of modern lineages. Now, let's be fair and generous to the scientific method. Researchers apply isotopic analyses, microstratigraphy, and taphonomic studies to reconstruct temperatures, rainfall, and seasonal cycles. Those methods have turned what might have been romantic speculation into a rigorous if still incomplete empirical narrative. Still, the fossil beds also summon a mythic register for storytellers who cannot resist the surreal tableau of a bat frozen mid-flight, or a primate's tooth revealing a diet that links it to far-off relatives. Some fringe voices have spun those images into tales of lost, giant fish, or unusual, warm-adapted, human-like creatures, claims not grounded in data but understandable in their impulse to fill a gap with drama. Imagine yourself kneeling at a slab in a museum, or in a field camp with a freshly split rock, the smell of shale and dust, the faint shine of mineralized scales, a fish's eye staring back as if surprised by time itself. In that intimate moment you hold an Eocene day between your hands. You can almost feel the lake's surface tension, hear insects buzz, and imagine a world warmer and greener than the one outside the museum door. The reflective insight here is simple and humbling. Deep time complicates our sense of belonging and continuity. It makes us realize that the ancient histories stored in rock are not only about loss but about transformation, the slow, patient remodeling of life. Still, for all the extraordinary microfossils and isotopic cleverness, we still don't know the full geography of those lakes in every season, the exact causes of every sudden die-off layer, and the nuanced web of biotic exchange between basins. Some details remain beyond inference, preserved as puzzles in stone. Turn the clock back from lakes to the thunder of dinosaur age at a place like Como Bluff, where bone beds erupted into public life in the late 19th century and rewrote paleontology with a mixture of science, greed, and spectacle. In the cliffs and quarries of this red-streaked site, strata laid down in the late Jurassic roughly 150 million years ago, paleontologists and fossil hunters collected an astonishing array of sauropods, theropods, and other dinosaurs whose bones were dense enough to support large-scale quarrying. The scale of the discovery is part of the story. Quarry trenches tens of meters across produced hundreds of specimens, enough to fill entire rooms of museums and to seed the nascent discipline of vertebrate paleontology in North America. But the social history of Como Bluff complicates the purely scientific narrative. This is where the bone wars, between rival paleontologists, giddy competition for priority, and dubious tactics like fossil destruction to prevent rivals from obtaining specimens turn field science into theater. The measurements, the lengths and weights estimated for some sauropods in the millions of kilograms, the depth of bone-bearing strata measured in meters, help us frame questions of ecology and behavior. What environments could sustain such megaherbivores? What predator-prey dynamics were at play? And how did these communities shift across the Jurassic landscapes? Geologically, the site records floodplain and channel deposits with periodic burials that concentrated skeletal remains into wonderful bone beds. But here's where it gets tricky. Beyond the messy human historiography of competition and theft, some paleontological puzzles persist. Taphonomists debate exactly how so many large individuals came to collocate. Were there mass mortality events, droughts, floods, disease, or did hydraulic sorting and the behavior of herding cause skeletal accumulations over time? Some of the most sensational public myths attached to dinosaur beds inspire claims of gigantic human skeletons, or of fossil hunters finding anomalous traces that suggest prehistoric giants. These stories are unsupported by excavation records, but speak to a human desire to superimpose our scale upon deep time. Scientific hypotheses remain cautious and data-driven. Sedimentology, bone orientation, and the presence of transport were informed models of how carcasses were deposited and fossilized. Imagine standing at a quarry where vertebrae the size of cars lie exposed in cross-section, your hands shadowing the hollow where ribs once articulated, and thinking about a living tissue transformed into mineral and story. There is a reflective ache in that tableau. The bones are evidence both of distant lives and of our own scientific appetite to bring those lives into present knowledge. Still, for all the careful stratigraphic mapping and the heroic 19th century collections that seeded modern museums, we still don't know every nuance of the ecosystems those dinosaurs inhabited. We still debate seasonality, migratory behavior, and how particular catastrophic events shaped the fossil record. The bones give us form, but they leave the full choreography of life, sounds, coloration, social structure, largely to informed imagination. Each of these sites, rock art, fossil lakes, and dinosaur bone beds, teaches a similar lesson about human limits and human curiosity. Data gives us contours but rarely completes a portrait. We build models and revise them, and as our tools sharpen, the questions become more interesting, not less. Picture yourself moving between these places in a single day. The sharp line of rock art against sunset, the cool, hushed laboratory light revealing fossil scale, the exposed vertebrae glittering under a high pale sun. Each place makes a different demand of your empathy and your method. The myths begin to speak louder when science steps back from a stubborn absence, and that is not a failure so much as a signal, an invitation to keep asking, to hold multiple explanations at once, and to respect both the rigor of evidence and the human narratives that make meaning out of places we still don't know. The cliffs along the upper Wind River Basin hold another kind of conversation in their faces, panels so dense and so complex that they read like entire plays frozen in stone, scenes of animals, humans, abstract forms, and strange composite beings that suggest a visual language matured into something both local and highly inventive. In the Dinwiddie and Torrey Creek districts, panels stretch for meters, some as long as 19 feet and 8 feet high, while other smaller boulders bear solitary figures that stare out across sage and glacial moraine. Archaeologists have counted scores of panels and hundreds of individual motifs in these clustered districts, and the stylistic coherence of many of the images, massed human forms, horned figures, intricate quadrupeds, invites the thought that these were not idle doodles but deliberate performances, a theater of identity enacted on bedrock. The Wind River petroglyphs lie in country long associated with Shoshone peoples and other plateau and plains-associated cultures, but like many rock art traditions, their authorship spans epochs and cannot be pinned to a single moment. The cliff panels and boulder canvases are often superimposed, Later hands rework earlier ones, adding headdresses, capping animals with horns, or carving new lines that reframe the old. That palimpsest quality is the site's primary language. People return, argue with a mark, and keep the conversation going. We can measure panel sizes, count figures, and map motifs across space to show where particular themes cluster. Hunting scenes near game trails, shamanic figures near springs, spiral motifs near horizon lines. But reading the actual meaning requires listening to oral history and respecting the privacy that tribal stewards sometimes ask for. Some scholars argue for ritual and shamanic interpretations, where composite figures represent trance states or spirit guides. Others emphasize social signaling, heraldic images that announce clan ties, hunting rites, or territorial markers. A still more speculative but seductive line of interpretation connects particular stellar motifs and concentric punctures to astronomical observation. Could a series of dotted arcs record comet passages or the heliacal rising of bright stars used to time movements? There are thoughtful, peer-reviewed arguments in favor of a calendrical reading in certain petroglyph traditions, but rock art seldom yields a single key. Picture yourself walking the narrow trail that skirts a high red cliff as the late afternoon sun thins. The images shift from crisp to ghost-like, masked figures emerging like actors from shadow, and you feel the electric sense that many people have stood here, watched the same light, and thought the same small sacred thought. The reflective insight here is that such panels are communal memory writ in stone, durable, portable neither by their makers nor their later audiences, meant to be read aloud and remarked upon across generations. Still, for all the measurements, the stylistic classifications, and the careful attention of curators and tribal historians, we still don't know the precise ritual meanings of many of these figures, nor the full sequence of their creation, nor which stories were once told aloud as hands carved each line. Not every carved stone is meant to be secret. Independence Rock sits along the Sweetwater River like a giant bulletin board for the 19th century westward migration, an enormous granite outcrop roughly 1,900 feet long and 850 feet wide where the passing emigrants of the Oregon and California trails stopped, camped, and left their names. The rock's smooth face is engraved with hundreds, by some counts thousands, of signatures, dates, and short messages carved by those who hoped that a mark might make them visible to future passers-by. In comparing Independence Rock to the far older petroglyph panels, we face an instructive contrast. One place records collective memory in images meant to speak across centuries to descendants whose names were never to be found. The other records an act of ephemeral self-assertion by travelers whose names were explicitly meant to be read by immediate peers. Those pioneer inscriptions are historical artifacts with known provenance. We can date many names to the 1820s through the 1860s, and we can sometimes match surnames to emigrant journals and family records. That specificity makes Independence Rock a rare kind of public archive, relatively recent by archaeological standards, densely datable, and culturally legible in ways that petroglyphs often are not. Yet even here a mystery persists. What modern visitors sometimes call the palimpsest of hopes raises ethical and interpretive questions about which inscriptions should be preserved, how to present them, and what the rock's deeper pre-contact history, erosion patterns, prehistoric use as a lookout or ceremonial place, might tell us about continuity of landscape value across cultures. Picture approaching the rock on a hot July afternoon in the 1840s. Travelers unyoke oxen, chip a name into the stone with a pocket knife, smoke a pipe, and move on. Their letters linger, fossilized in grit. The reflective insight is blunt and humane. In different eras, people used the same stone to leave profoundly different kinds of messages, some to gods, some to future kin, and some simply to mark, for a day, that they passed that way. Still, we still don't know the full prehistory of Independence Rock before it became an emigrant billboard. We still don't know all the ways indigenous peoples may have used or regarded that outcrop long before the first pioneer scratched his name. If stones can record what humans have done, then hot springs and terraces record what life and chemistry have done together over time, and nowhere in Wyoming does that partnership appear more theatrical than at Mammoth Hot Springs. Here the travertine terraces, calcite and carbonate structures shaped by mineral-rich waters, rise like white, frozen cascades, each ledge a chronicle of thermal chemistry, microbial colonization, and geological patience. The springs are fed by groundwater heated deep beneath the Yellowstone caldera, though Mammoth's travertine is a different mineral expression than the siliceous sinter often seen at other thermal features. Thermophilic bacteria and mats catalyze mineral deposition, accelerating terrace growth in ways that are both biological and inorganic. Scientists using modern geochemistry and microbial ecology have shown that microbes are not mere passengers on the travertine. They materially influence deposit textures and the pace of carbonate precipitation, making the springs an interface of geology and life. That insight changed an older view that treated such terraces as purely inorganic precipitates. It elevated microbial communities as architects of stone. Yet even with such progress, the terraces admit puzzles. The precise historical trajectories of terrace formation, why some ledges aggrade more rapidly at particular times, why channels shift and terraces die back, and how short-term hydrologic variability interacts with long-term geologic trends, remain contested in detail, in part because thermal systems are highly sensitive to fractures, groundwater chemistry, and subtle shifts beneath the surface. Add to that the human hunger for meaning, and you'll find tales that spin the terraces into mystical sites, portals, petrified waterfalls shaped by spirits, or loci of visions. When you stand on a boardwalk above a terrace pool, steam rising and microbes painting the ledges with vivid mats, you are looking at a place where chemistry and life write stone in real time. You can watch the active processes that, aggregated across centuries, produce the vast white shelves that impress visitors today. The reflective insight. Stone is not always only a memory of the past. Sometimes it is an ongoing text being edited daily by life and water. Still, for all the microbial ecology and the detailed geochemical monitoring, we still don't fully understand how the interplay of deep geothermal flux, shallow hydrology, and living mats will play out over centuries, nor can we perfectly predict which terraces will expand and which will be reworked by future seismic or climatic shifts. Returning to human hands on a different register, consider the small, precise caches and hearths that appear in sheltered alcoves around springs and river bends, features that often contain organic remains, flake stone, and charred seeds and bones. It is in these kinds of deposits, sometimes only a few centimeters thick, that archaeologists have been able to reach back into the early Holocene and late Pleistocene to find evidence of how people lived in what is now Wyoming when climates ran colder and megafauna still roamed. Radiocarbon dates from properly stratified hearths can place human activity at particular times, sometimes as early as the terminal Pleistocene in isolated sites, though the patchy preservation of organic matter in high plains soils makes such finds rare and precious. What emerges from these hearth assemblages is an intimate view of daily life, the chipped edges of projectile points intended for atlatls or later for bow and arrow technology, the charred residues of seeds once dried and eaten, and the bones of bison or now extinct horses that attest to hunting strategies. These small domestic traces are often overshadowed in popular imagination by the grandiosity of petroglyphs and fossil cliffs, yet they form the backbone of a much more detailed behavioral archaeological picture. Still, here is where the problem of absence bites. Hearths can tell us that someone cooked or slept at a place, but they are mute on the larger social questions. Why did groups move at particular seasons? How were kinship networks organized? What belief systems motivated certain site choices? Some hypotheses suggest finely tuned seasonal rounds, spring hunting in river valleys, summer aggregations for raw material exchange, fall butchering tied to rutting seasons, while other models highlight opportunistic mobility shaped by unpredictable climates. Both can be true in different places and times. Picture crouching beside a thin hearth layer, trowel in hand and dust on your knuckles, knowing the charcoal you lift will be processed in a lab and may anchor someone's life in time. The reflective insight is an unglamorous one. Big narratives rest on small acts of survival, and those acts often leave the thinnest traces. Still, for all the radiocarbon anchors and lithic typologies, we still don't have a continuous, high-resolution record of how social networks changed year by year in this region during the last 12,000 years. Much remains inferential and debated among specialists. The state's deep past also keeps pulling us back to its fossil record, where mysteries take a different biological tack. In the Eocene green riverbeds we can read whole lake days and slivers of shale. Fish preserved with stomach contents instruct us about diet and behavior, and fossil birds and bats twist our expectations about early mammal diversification. The Green River sequence, dating roughly from 53.5 to 48.5 million years ago and many of its best-studied members, sits as a laboratory for paleoclimatology. Isotopic ratios in carbonate and organic residues let researchers estimate seasonal temperatures and rainfall patterns, revealing an interior west significantly warmer and wetter than today. Those isotopic and fossil data create a rich but partial narrative. They demonstrate that Wyoming's ecology was once nearly tropical, but they also expose gaps. How exactly did regional drainage networks shift to produce isolated lakes like Fossil Lake? And what were the precise biotic exchange pathways connecting these basins to other Eocene ecosystems? Competing models argue for long-lived isolation that promoted local endemism, while others propose episodic hydrologic connections that allowed more exchange and migration of lineages. Either way, the paleontological record demonstrates both evolutionary radiation and a global climate whose swings we are still trying to model accurately. Imagine holding a slab where a primate's tooth bears brushstrokes of diet, or a fish's stomach reveals its last meal. Those small pieces of data spin a large story about how life responds to shifting climate. The reflective insight. By studying these deep records we are, in a sense, reading the Earth's experiments with life, experiments whose outcomes can help us model present-day ecological changes. Still, for all the exceptional fossils and precise isotopic work, we still don't know every connection between ancient basins, nor can we reconstruct every behavioral nuance of extinct species. Many ecological details remain shadows on the wall of deep time. Across all these places, petroglyph cliffs, emigrant-inscribed outcrops, travertine terraces, hearths, and fossil limestones, the recurring human drama is the same. We make marks, we read marks, and we model explanations, but the past often keeps a margin of silence. That silence is not emptiness but invitation. It is what causes scientists to keep asking questions and storytellers to keep imagining. When you walk through Wyoming's varied landscapes, you move through a layered archive where geology, biology, and human action interleave in ways that are sometimes legible and sometimes obdurately private. Picture yourself traveling a loop that touches each of these sites in turn. The hush of a cliff face, a hot pool's hiss and mineral sheen, the brittle scale of a fossil, the carved name of a migrant, and the flattened cairn under a starbent sky. Each place is a chapter in a long human and natural experiment, and together they ask you to hold fact and feeling, data and story, in tandem. We still don't know. When we step back from any single panel, cairn, bone bed, or steaming terrace and take in the whole of Wyoming, its ridges and basins, its fossil layers and carved faces, we begin to see a single, braided argument, that the earth and the people who have moved across it are always writing and rewriting each other. Rocks hold scripts written by sunlight, water, and life. People mark those rocks with images and names. Scientists decode some of the ink and admit the rest to the patient humility of models. There is a rhythm to this work, a movement between the precise and the poetic that is not accidental but structural. The precise measurements, the diameters and spokes of a stone circle, the elevation lines of a columnar basalt, the isotopic ratios in carbonate laminae, are our scaffolding. They allow us to build credible inferences, to test hypotheses, to falsify and refine. The poetic elements, the bear who scratches a cliff into an origin story, the spirals that may be star charts, or may be the marks of repeated ritual touch, are not errors in reasoning but complementary ways humans have always held the same data and asked different questions. If we are honest, we must respect both methods: skepticism that demands evidence, and imagination that refuses to accept the cosmos as a ledger alone. Together they form the only honest path toward understanding a place that refuses neat endings. The sites we've walked through maintain a deliberate ambiguity because history itself is rarely monolithic. People return to favored promontories across centuries, sometimes for food, sometimes for ceremony, sometimes to scratch a name into a stone out of the simple human need to be noticed. Those return visits create palimpsests, overriding, reworking, and making syntax out of accidental adjacency. A spiral carved in one era may be reinterpreted, capped, or stylized by another generation until the original intent is buried under a stack of living meanings. This is not merely an archaeological inconvenience, it is the substance of cultural continuity. The medicine wheel, with its spokes and cairns, is practical and ceremonial at once. Devil's Tower is igneous geometry and a living spiritual place. The petroglyphs are both maps and prayers. The travertine terraces are both chemistry and microbrunn sculpture. Fossils teach us about climates we only imagine otherwise, and emigrant scratches on Independence Rock reveal how recent histories layer themselves on older landscapes. Each interpretation, whether scientific, tribal, or imaginative, answers a different human need. Science seeks mechanism and timeline. Indigenous oral histories seek relationship and moral orientation. Myth seeks meaning when mechanism is not asked or not sufficient. None of these aims are more human than another, they are simply different ways humans relate to time, place, and one another. That plurality should not be used as an excuse for relativism. Where data is robust, we must be careful with claims, especially those that flatten complexity into spectacle. At the same time, we must also recognize that for many peoples these landscapes are not loose facts to be rearranged at leisure. They are repositories of sacred law, anchors of identity, and sources of moral obligation. The conversations about naming, access, and stewardship are therefore not peripheral comments but central themes of any modern engagement with these places. When policymakers, tribal leaders, scientists, and communities argue about how to manage a site, they are doing more than arguing over signs and fences. They are negotiating whose histories are allowed to be visible, whose rituals are allowed to persist, and how a nation remembers the past it prefers and forgets the past it finds inconvenient. That negotiation, if it is to be just, must attend to both the rigor of evidence and the dignity of tradition. Another theme that threads these mysteries together is scale, temporal and human. Some of our most astonishing data comes from times incomprehensibly long to our lives. The Eocene fish and plant beds that record climates almost unrecognizable to our senses, or the Jurassic bone beds that preserve animals not just outside modern taxonomy, but outside our daily frame of reference. Those deep time records humble us by insisting that what we think of as natural is merely the latest iteration of a long-running experiment. Paleontology teaches the kind of humility that is constructive. Species flourish, migrate, adapt, and vanish. Basins open and close. The chemistry of lakes shifts and rewrites the living inventory. But there is also an everyday human scale present at hearths and rock art panels. Charred seeds and flakestones tell us about a family's meal or a hunter's return. A pioneer name carved in the heat of passage speaks of hope and exhaustion in equal measure. When you place these scales side by side, you find that the future of a terrace or a petroglyph can be read through both the long lens of geologic change and the short, fierce lens of human life. We are both enormous and tiny to the landscapes we occupy. That tension fuels both our science and our storytelling. Equally important is the recurring pattern of contested narrative. Every site has voices that want to make it into a single, digestible story: the creation myth, the tidy archaeological report, the sensational theory that brings tourists and headlines. Yet every site resists that flattening. Evidence, interpretation, reverence, commerce, and curiosity all exert pressure, but the most ethically sound engagements are those that resist closure. That is not to say we must live forever in a fog of uncertainty. It is to say that some questions do not and should not settle into final answers because to settle them risks erasing the plural human meanings that animate a place. The appropriate stance for public storytelling, especially on platforms that reach millions of viewers, should therefore be a particular kind of humility. We can describe what is measured, we can assess which interpretations have the most support, and we can honor the narratives that have weight in living communities without pretending to speak for them. This way of telling does practical work as well. When scientists publish radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic columns, or isotopic analyses, they are not only building knowledge, they are creating a shared factual space where disputes can be adjudicated. When tribal historians invoke oral traditions, they are asserting continuity and moral claims often ignored in dry empirical accounts. When artists and storytellers treat a site as mythic, they expand public empathy and keep attention on places that might otherwise fade under inattention or commercial pressure. Each voice, if responsibly voiced, forms part of a civic ecology that can support responsible stewardship, careful excavation strategies, inclusive interpretive signage, protective measures against erosion and vandalism, and legal frameworks that respect both scientific inquiry and indigenous rights. The best outcomes occur where these conversations are not isolated but co-creative, where a park ranger, a geologist, and an elder can all shape how a place is told to future visitors. Perhaps the most enduring lesson from Wyoming's suite of unsolved ancient mysteries is the value of sustained attention. Mystery is not a void to be filled as quickly as possible. It is a depth that rewards prolonged, patient engagement. The work of archaeology and paleontology proceeds in small increments, a calibrated sample here, an isotope tested there, each piece widening the field of view a little. Similarly, the work of cultural reconciliation, restoring names, acknowledging protocols, enabling ceremonies, happens in slow, sometimes awkward, civic steps. Patience is not only a virtue but a method. It allows data to accumulate, it lets oral histories breathe across generations, and it gives time for the ethical frameworks that govern access and research to mature. If you go back to the ridge where the stone will sits and stand very still at dawn, if you kneel at fossil Butte and hold a slab to the light, if you trace a petroglyph by dusk and imagine the fingers that first scored its lines, these acts are not merely tourist curiosities. They are practices of attention, low-cost rituals that build a habit of care. In the practice of attention, the distinction between scientist and pilgrim narrows. Both listen, both look, both measure, both imagine. That overlap is the hopeful human core of these mysteries. It says that being in the presence of the unknown can teach us not only about the distant past but about the shape of our own ethical imaginations. So what do we take home from these layered landscapes? We take both knowledge and restraint. We take the understanding that empirical rigor is indispensable, and that stories without evidence can mislead. We also take the broader lesson that uncertainty is not a failure to be corrected but a dimension of reality that broadens our engagement with it. The unsolved questions, about dates and makers, about connections and intentions, about the exact choreography of ecosystems long gone, are not obstacles between us and understanding but invitations to deeper conversation. They ask us to become better listeners, more creative modelers, and more generous keepers of the past. They invite scientists to humility, tribes to recognition, and everyone who cares about place to patience. And finally, there is an invitation to you, to keep looking, to keep asking, to let wonder guide interrogation. Go to the stones with a tape measure and a camera and a soft heart. Read the lab reports, sit with elders, and admit when you do not know. Science will build from the careful next step, and stories will grow richer when they are humble about what they claim. The land keeps its own calendar. Sometimes it reveals a page, and sometimes it waits. But it is always ready to teach those who will attend, not only the facts we add to our notebooks but the manner in which we add them. That ethic, to care, to verify, to honor, is the best way to treat places that occupy both the map and the imagination. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.